I'm Allison Castor from UFG Insurance, a proud sponsor of this year's event. Like many great companies, UFG was born from one person's idea. That idea was to form a stock insurance company in Iowa back in 1946. 75 years later, we're a successful, publicly traded, and locally headquartered company, proud to call Iowa our home. At this year's Iowa Ideas event, we at UFG hope you find inspiration in the stories you hear and feel empowered to let your own ideas come to life.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the 2022 Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm Gazette Executive Editor Zach Kacharski, and on behalf of the entire Gazette team and our advisory councils and all of those who have worked to put this event together, thank you for joining us for day 2 of the conference. I hope everyone enjoyed speed networking this morning. There were a few abrupt transfers, so I'm sorry for the folks that I didn't get to say goodbye to in the speed networking before the rooms changed. But don't forget to keep using the community boards and keep connecting using the attendee directory. You can send messages to folks and connect that way, as well as the social media hashtag Iowa Ideas 22. We've been very fortunate to have a great conference experience thanks to our presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, including a great lineup of keynote speakers, and that's thanks to our keynote sponsor, UFG Insurance. This morning, I'm excited to introduce our Friday morning keynote, Michele Shelton. Michele is an international speaker, author, executive coach, and consultant specializing in race and gender equity, and has been disrupting the DEI space for more than 20 years. Michele equips and empowers courageous executives to make inclusivity and equity more than just a goal by confronting and conquering the isms that threaten both our humanity and the bottom line at work and beyond. We'll start with a short video and then we welcome Michele.
The brutal killing of George Floyd triggered a national reckoning with racism unlike anything we've seen since the 60s. And it sparked new conversations about systemic racism and how we all need to be fighting to end it. Black racism was born 400 years ago when 12 million Africans were dehumanized and sold into slavery, and then continued with the terrorism of lynchings, the Tulsa race massacre, and Jim Crow segregation. And although the civil rights movement changed history by fighting for equality and justice, systemic racism, the kind that infiltrates institutions like banks, schools, and the law, is much more insidious. Let's look back and see how systemic racism became embedded in American society. Back in the 1930s, when Social Security was introduced, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers, and they accounted for 2/3 of Black Americans. This inequality forced many older Black Americans into poverty and homelessness. Between 1934 and 1962, the Federal Housing Authority underwrote $120 billion of home mortgages, and 98% of them went to white people. Federal policy said that Black neighborhoods were a bad risk and therefore not eligible for loans. Even the GI Bill excluded Black veterans from its beneficial housing provisions. Since then, house values have risen dramatically, giving white homeowners a huge bump in wealth from which Black people were excluded. Redlining was the system used by banks to determine which neighborhoods would get loans to buy homes. Black neighborhoods, outlined in red ink, were deemed the riskiest to invest in. Redlining made it impossible for Black people to get loans. Redlined areas also didn't have the tax base to fund good schools, healthcare systems, or transportation, causing safety concerns and subsequent over-policing, which seeded the problems we see today. Even now, predominantly white schools receive more than $20 billion more funding than districts that serve mostly students of color. And today, Black home ownership is at an all-time low, only 42% compared to 72% for whites. This generational history matters when we talk about the wealth gap because inheritances are very significant to current wealth, and family wealth takes generations to build. In the U.S., white families hold 90% of the national wealth, Latino families hold 2.3%, and Black families hold 2.6%. Racial pay inequities widen the gap. This year, the average white worker made 30% more than the typical Black worker. With the whole family's income, Black households earn 60% of the average white household. Lower incomes mean that the poverty rate for Black families is over twice that of white families. Black individuals are also twice as likely to be unemployed than white individuals. And even though the number of Black college graduates is growing, they're twice as likely to be unemployed as all other graduates. One U.S. study found that job resumes with traditionally white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than those with traditionally Black names. African Americans are still incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites, even though imprisonment rates have fallen in the past few years. Black inmates make up over 30% of prisons, yet only 12% of the country's population. And even though African Americans and whites use drugs at similar rates, the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of whites. Black Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested, and once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to get lengthy prison sentences. Let's look at police stops. The Stanford University study analyzed more than 100 million traffic stops across America and found Black drivers are 20% more likely to be pulled over and more likely to be searched. In fact, in New York City, 88% of police stops in 2018 involved Black and Latino people, while 10% involved white people. Of those stops, 70% were completely innocent. A crisis like COVID highlights the inequalities in a society. Black people are dying of COVID at 3 times the rate of white people because of higher rates of underlying health conditions, higher density poor neighborhoods, more employed as frontline workers, and poorer access to testing and healthcare. So that's systemic racism. This awakening to injustice is our chance to make it right. Listen, learn, and act now.
Please help me in welcoming Michele. Michele, take it away.
Thank you, Zach. Good morning, Iowa. How is everyone? I hope that all of you out there in remote land are doing well. And it is my pleasure to be here with you this morning. And I want to start out by just saying thank you, a huge thank you to Zach and Quinn, Brittany, and all of the folks who worked so hard to put together the Iowa Ideas Conference. It is absolutely a delight for me to be joining you this morning. And I look forward to our time together. I do have a few slides that I would like to walk through with you as we explore more about systemic racism and the issues that we are facing in society around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to hold while the team pulls that up, but I just want to say to all of you that I want to commend you for loving your state so much that you're willing to come together across all different sectors, all different industries, and have the conversations that are necessary to just be honest with one another about the condition of your state, where you are in Iowa, around so many different areas. I understand you all have been talking about arts and culture, community development, education, energy, environment, the workplace, and so on and so forth, healthcare and human and social services, which have absolutely been at the forefront here lately. But you know what really is going to make the difference are the policies that you're able to evaluate and hopefully improve as a result of your coming together. So following this video, if you haven't figured it out yet, we're going to be talking a little bit about race. And we're going to talk about the race case for diversity because, folks, the reality is that there's a lot of unfinished business when it comes to that. There's unfinished business when it comes to talking about DE&I when we can't still have the conversations about race. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get into this because we do have a short period of time together. And I want to make sure that we get the best use out of it as possible. Slide, please. What we're going to talk about is really just this idea of the evolution of diversity. There's been a lot of conversation around not just diversity, but equity and inclusion now. And what do we do about that? How do we bring all of that together to make sure that we're having the most effective and best experience that we possibly can as a collective, not just what's happening with individuals, but how do we ensure that we're honoring that? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of diversity, and so that we're all on the same page when we're talking about these concepts. We're also going to focus on unfinished business around the discussion. and whether or not it's okay to have a conversation about race in and of itself. We're going to talk about some solutions as well, because we're still struggling, folks, to figure this out. And I don't feel that that's something that I need to tell you. The reality is, especially if you're someone who is being subjected to racism, if you're someone who's being subjected to othering, you know that there's still a lot of work that we need to do. And that could be othering for a number of reasons when we think about this through the lens of diversity. But again, our focus, our emphasis for today is going to be on race, and where do we sit with regard to that? How do we address this unfinished business so that we can begin to make the headway that's necessary? Slide, please. This flag represents a lot of things to a lot of people. And I started my career out in civil rights enforcement decades ago. And, you know, I spent quite a bit of time investigating workplace discrimination complaints, sexual harassment complaints, and going into large corporations and turning things upside down, evaluating evidence, and trying to figure out what was happening. What led me into this space after several years in government, serving at that level of civil rights enforcement, overseeing diversity and equality for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and now as a business owner, a consultant, a coach, an international speaker, you know, what led me into this field of diversity is this understanding that we are having a hard time, though we may hope to stand united under this flag. We're having a hard time really seeing one another because we have yet to come to terms with the awesome promise and the awesome hope and optimism that this flag represented, not only to the founding fathers, but also those who come to this country in hopes of having a greater experience, and certainly those who are born into this country, who hold their heads up high with pride. You know, when I was serving as that civil rights enforcement officer, I had an opportunity to go to my first naturalization ceremony, and it was a beautiful thing to be there. I'm there and I'm watching all of these folks who had come to the country and who were looking forward to having a much better experience. And I watched as they stood there and they took their oath. And I asked myself the question, what is it? What is it that makes people feel so good about this idea, this notion of getting to America? And I flipped over the program, and on the back, I saw these words: "You who have been born in America, I wish I could make you understand what it is like not to be an American, not to have been an American all your life." And then suddenly, with the words of a man in flowing robes, to be one for that moment and forever after. One moment you belong with your fathers to a million dead yesterdays. The next you belong with America to a million unborn tomorrows. That, of course, was penned by George Magar Mardikian. And if you've ever been to the Epcot Center, you may notice that that is etched on the wall there. I think that often we forget the power, if you will, of hope, what it means to be able to see beyond your circumstances, adversity, and even injustice, and think about the possibility of having a better day, to idealize that things can get better and that they can change. And that is what I hope for all of you as you've come together this week for this conference, and as you engage one another, that you hold on to that power of hope and the reality that things can and they should, they must, and they will, with all of us coming together, get better. Slide, please. But as I think about what we've been through here lately, the reality is that we have been through quite a bit as a country, as a world, coming through a pandemic. And often as folks are engaging and thinking about what is going to be our path forward, our way forward, the conversation centers around this idea of the pandemic and COVID-19 and what COVID-19 did, how it disrupted and how it destroyed. And let me just say, while I'm on the subject, for those of you who suffered losses, you lost loved ones as a result of the pandemic, from the bottom of my heart, I extend my condolences to you. The pandemic took over in ways that none of us could have anticipated, none of us could have known, and we all did the absolute best that we could to just try to stay safe. But being closed in and restricted during that time forced us into a greater level of awareness of what it's like to have our freedom taken away. That is a state that many who are a part of this country and seen as others have lived in long before the pandemic. And for those who, as a result of coming out of the pandemic, have said, I never want to return, welcome. Welcome to what it's like to want things to get better. Welcome to what it's like to want to be free and to know that you can walk and be seen and live your life according to the terms that you choose, according to the reality that you are a human being who desires and needs social connection with others. Because the reality is that many in this country have had some of those rights taken away, and some are still struggling to be seen and heard and valued as the human beings who should have access to those very freedoms without restriction. It wasn't just, however, COVID that we are recovering from and still grappling with. We had the Me Too movement, which many women came together and said, we've had enough of dealing with sexual harassment and repercussions for trying to stand up and speak out for ourselves. Thank goodness for Tarana Burke and the fact that she created this movement initially to inspire and bring hope to young girls to know that if they had suffered any form of sexual violence and abuse, that they were not alone and that there were women who would stand with them. Thank goodness for her insight and her hope in thinking that if we start talking about this, then people can be inspired, they can be uplifted, and they can know that they can overcome that adversity. And it became this national movement where we had everyone signing on from Hollywood to Hoptown saying, yes, we need to talk about this issue. We also had racial justice, as we've already seen, and we talked about systemic injustices, systemic racism, and what it means to be a part of a system that continues to oppress the rights of others, a system that is so deeply embedded and ingrained in this country's history and its fabric even today, that there are inequalities and inequities that we can no longer continue to ignore. And as we've come out of this and folks are returning back to work, they're asking themselves, what is going on? What really matters in the world these days? And why, how am I living? And why do I do the things that I do? Why do I work where I work? Why do I have the social circles that I have? And what's happening is folks are hitting reset. Some are resigning from positions that they maybe thought they would retire from. Others are going into work and just kind of going through the motions, something we're calling quiet quitting. They're going through the motions and they're having this experience that they sometimes can't quite put their finger on, but they know that something is different. But most importantly, they know that they want something more, they want something better. As COVID-19 caused many of those who were people of color and in lower income brackets, great losses. As women said, we can't continue to accept and deal with this. As African Americans and Black people and those who identify as ADOS, American descendants of slaves, said we've had enough, Black lives do matter. And many outside of the race decided they would stand in solidarity with them as allies. As folks mostly between the ages of 30 and 45, not the only, but a vast majority have said, I've got to find something else to do that helps me to feel more fulfilled in how I choose to spend my time every day. We're now left with this question of trying to ask ourselves, what is culture? How do we define it? Who is in the position to define that? And what ultimately should that look like? So that we can make sure that folks are having the experiences that they need to have in the workplace and beyond. Those who serve as leaders in organizations, you are smack dab in the middle of all of this, trying to figure out how to continue to navigate the responsibilities that you have, the obligations that you have, as well as bring folks together who are coming in from very different places and spaces and mindsets. And it can be overwhelming at times. But what we're going to do is talk about the fact that although it may be overwhelming, it may be considerable, it may be challenging at times, there is still a need for us to continue to focus on making sure that we are moving forward in this space. Slide, please. The reality is that with the murder of George Floyd, We had, through the Washington Post article that was recently posted, 50 of America's largest companies, and their foundations who said, you know what? We hear what's going on. We don't want to turn a blind eye to this. We understand that our workplaces, our organizations are microcosms of the greater society, and we're going to recognize and acknowledge the fact that racism is still an issue. Systemic racism in particular, where again, it's about the system, how we operate through our organizations and our institutions. It's a public health threat. And many made pledges to support change. They made pledges to make sure that we were putting policies and resources in place to help to begin to turn the tide away from all of these injustices. But the reality is, according to the Washington Post, that while these companies and their foundations pledged about $49.5 billion to these efforts, about a year later, what we noticed is most of the companies who had made these large pledges, out of them, about 68% had done still nothing. And for those who did make the pledges, 90% of the measures that they committed to led to an immediate return in profits for the company. So yes, they contributed $49.5 billion, but again, 90% of the measures would result in immediate profits back to these companies. The other piece that was interesting to note in that article is that the combined income of those companies and foundations amounted to only 1%. 1% of their total combined income is what that financial commitment amounted to. $49.5 billion, about 1% of the total combined income. So when you think about that through the lens of commitment, the benefits to the companies and the foundations, but then ultimately the question of what are they willing to give up? 1%, while in dollar figure alone, sounds like quite a bit. And thank you for those who contributed. But that alone is not enough. It's not enough. And it's certainly not enough with a commitment that's going to make sure that we do more than just throw money at the problem. So when we think about this idea of little to no progress, where we're struggling is in three specific areas that I want to just highlight quickly. And those three areas are leadership, resources, and goals. And one of the reasons why I think we're struggling is because there are myths that are in place around those three areas specific to leadership. There's still a question amongst a lot of organizations with regard to who should be engaged, who should make the decisions, and who should lead these efforts. And often what happens is organizations bring in chief diversity officers. And what we saw was a huge increase in terms of the hiring of chief diversity officers over the past several years. From 2018 to 2020, 2015 to 2020, we saw an increase with regard to proportion of C-suite hires of chief diversity officers of about 107%. 84% of that took place in 2020 after the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. The hiring of chief diversity officers skyrocketed. And you know, what's interesting to note is it's been since September 2020 and August of 2021, it went up to 111%. The proportion of C-suite hires that were chief diversity officers. But we struggled in getting chief diversity officers in and in position to be able to effectively make a change within their organizations. Because the leadership perspective was, once we hire a chief diversity officer, that's all it takes. And a chief diversity officer will come in and figure everything out for us and tell us what we need to do, and they'll fix the problem. Well, it's hard to do that, folks, without resources. So the second area where we're struggling with the myths is when it comes to resources, what's necessary? Well, many of these chief diversity officers were brought in and they were a one-person show. They didn't have teams, they didn't have support, and many of them lacked support from the C-suite itself. So in struggling through that and trying to come in and change a culture, define a culture, improve a culture, spread hope within a culture, many of them found themselves in a no-win situation, because the reality is many of these folks are also people of color. who are brought in and people see them as the great hope. Well, because of the stress, the strain, the overwhelming expectations, and often unrealistic, what we saw was that chief diversity officers, usually in 2018, they had a tenure of about 3 years. Well, that dropped to about 1.8 years because so many of them were stressed and overwhelmed. And when you're struggling to try to figure out your place in an organization and what resources you're going to have to really make the difference that you've been brought in to make, it's hard to figure out what goals need to be set. And when it comes to goals, the challenge that many organizations have had is they don't know who they are or what it is that they need to do specifically, and certainly not how to go about it. So we find ourselves grappling with this idea of how do we address race and diversity, and why is it that it keeps being put on the back burner, especially if we feel that it's a public health threat. Slide, please. Many organizations have committed to saying, if we do something for women, if we do something for LGBTQ plus community, that's great. We'll have everything that we need. But the reality is it takes so much more than that. When we think about quiet quitting and the great resignation, there are so many folks who have said, I need more, I want more. And organizations have asked the question, well, what specifically is it that people are wanting? Why is it that they continue to leave the organization? We're doing everything that we possibly can. Well, here is what folks are saying they want. When they think about what it is that they hope to experience, especially now that there's been this awakening, if you will, and people are reevaluating how they show up and how they spend their time, even at work. They're looking for diverse teams. They want value versus volume. In other words, they want organizations to recognize the value in the work that they do and stop beating them over the head to reach quotas and to focus solely on how much you're doing. But what is the quality of the work? And most importantly, how does it align with the overall goals of the organization? People want space to be able to think about how is it that they can show up even better and be creative and innovative around the work that they do. And they want trust. They want to be trusted themselves. They want to trust their leaders in their organizations. And that trust doesn't go very far if people don't feel seen, heard, valued, and respected. So when we're talking about trust, we can't just look at this through the lens of what we think trust is. But it's important that, again, we find a way to connect across differences and understand how trust is defined by those who are engaging us on a day-to-day basis. And whether you think it's reality or not, there are folks who are still looking for what they call work-life balance. And sometimes that balance shows up just when people feel like they're able to show up at work and be exactly who they are. And that, guess what? That's okay. When they can show up at work and feel that their values are in alignment with what is expected of them. And that's okay. But here's the reality of it all. When we think about how do we accomplish this, it's still a struggle to figure out the best way to go about that. And we have folks in HR departments who are scratching their heads and they're saying, we just don't understand why people are still leaving and why they're not happy. And we think that this is what we're giving them, but we can't quite figure it out. Well, right now we've got a lot of folks who are resisting return to work or return to office RTO policies, because a lot of those were made without corporations and organizations doing one simple thing, and that was asking employees what they want. This is the era of the workforce. They have recognized they are coming into a greater awareness of their power, and they're beginning to push back. The organizations that are going to be successful and succeed, not only in this space, but at every level, are going to be those that recognize the value in their employees being able to contribute beyond just their day-to-day roles and responsibilities. But as we continue to scratch our heads and try to figure out what is it that we need to do to bring folks together, often it's just a matter of asking. And a recent poll by Gallup says that, employees who are at companies that make grand promises, but when they get there, the experience is very different, don't stick around long. And specifically, those who perceive that bias are present in the company are nearly 3 times as likely to leave that organization or be disengaged at work. Companies are losing an estimated $450 to $550 billion per year because of disengagement. And that disengagement is that quiet quitting that ultimately will lead to the great resignation. If we take the time to ask our employees what is it that they need, what is it that they want, if we take the time to engage our employees when we make grand commitments and grand statements to who we are as organizations and what it is that we stand for, when we engage them and we follow through on that, then that helps the employees themselves to begin to trust a little bit more. And we have greater experiences at work. But also when we just ask simple questions of what is it that you're hoping for, they're willing to say, we want trust, we want safety, and we want hope. And when you give that to us, then we're happy to give you the engagement that you want. We're happy to give you the innovation that you're looking for, because when I'm more engaged, I'm looking for ways to be better, do better, and my creativity is activated. I'll stick around. So your retention levels will go through the roof, and so will your profits when I'm engaged as an employee. But folks, because we are still struggling to see the realities that different employees experience as a result of race in the workplace, we're still struggling to figure out how do we make this work for everyone. Well, you heard in the video earlier that there is a huge wealth gap. And the reality is that the American Council of Economic Advisors to the White House pre-COVID shared statistics regarding median wealth in the Black and white communities. And they said that white families had a median wealth of $189,100 compared to Black families, which was $24,100. Folks, this was pre-COVID. You can only imagine how that number has changed, how drastically it has changed as a result of the pandemic. But I can submit to you that if there is a commitment to make sure that folks have an opportunity to experience even everything that we see on the screen without making sure that they have the financial resources in place through compensation to be able to have the quality of life that they want, I'm not quite sure how effective this will be. So there is another issue that we have to deal with when we think about the interconnectedness of all of these issues, all of the areas where you all serve, and many are already aware of the disparities that exist. Slide, please. So what do we need in order to get to a place to where we can create this experience for folks? We need leadership. We need strong leadership, and leadership that steps up bolder than ever before. Because leadership can no longer be a passive privilege. Those who are called to lead today must absolutely embrace it as a call to action. It's no longer about your position, your title, your office space, whether it's at home or in the office place. It's about understanding that we have a need to be able to instill hope back into the folks that we engage. And leadership isn't just about being at the top of the organization. You can be a leader at any level. And right now, we need people to step up and lead throughout the organizations, those who have the social capital and the influence to be able to help to motivate, uplift, inspire, and encourage your coworkers. We need that, especially as we're trying to figure out ways to connect more in virtual environments. We need folks who are willing to lead the effort, if for no other reason than to make sure that we have leaders of hope in place. Slide, please. So what do these leaders need to do, especially those who are in C-suite level positions? Well, we need you to be courageous, and we need you to have the courage to know the truth, embrace the truth, and make sure that folks have the knowledge that they need. A truth that says that, when it comes to this idea, this notion of race, we cannot continue to act like it's not important. And we can talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion when it comes to everything but that. But we want to make sure that we're clear on what diversity, equity, and inclusion are, because they're often used interchangeably. And what I want to do really quickly is just clarify that truth for you. And that is that, of course, we focused on equality in the 50s and the 60s with the civil rights movement. And what we discovered through all of those efforts, and ultimately Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when that was passed, that granted access for folks to be able to go into workplaces and other spaces and not be discriminated against. It was about access. But we realized that it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough because we couldn't trust that corporations and other organizations would operate in good faith. So in 1965, President Johnson passed through executive order affirmative action that required folks who receive federal funding to make sure that they were meeting certain quotas with respect to increasing opportunity for folks who were underrepresented in their workplaces, but ultimately that benefited white women more than it did people of color, Black people in particular. So what happened is in the 70s, we had to have another conversation to figure out what more needs to be done. And that there then comes this idea, this notion, this field of diversity, where we're talking about making sure that we're not just focusing on one group, but we're expanding the conversation to include multiple groups, and that we're looking for ways to continue to be very specific and intentional about bringing Black people and other people of color into workplaces. In about 2000, we started to talk about this notion of inclusivity. Many of you may recall Vernon Myers' quote that diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusivity is being asked to dance, or inclusion is being asked to dance. Well, I submit to you, we're now in a place where we're talking about equity. Equity goes beyond just recognizing that I'm there, inviting me to the table or to the floor, asking me what I think. But equity says you're going to open your heart, your mind, and the possibilities, if you will, to really understand my circumstances and my condition. If we stick with Vernon Myers' idea of the dance, then I would just say that equity is about making sure that not only am I invited and that once I get there, you ask me to dance, but equity is making sure that I have the shoes that will help me to glide smoothly across the floor, that I have the clothing, if you will, to be dressed to impress as along with everyone else, and that I have the transportation to get to the dance. Because the reality is that many folks are struggling with just those basic needs that will prepare them to be able to get into the places where they are allowed to show their faces and be asked to sit at the table or step to the dance floor. They're struggling with being prepared to show up at their best and meet their highest potential when they get there. That's what equity in and of itself is about. And we see that displayed through the image that we have at the bottom of the screen, for those of you who can see it, where equality says everybody gets the same thing. But equity says, no, we recognize that there isn't fairness in terms of everybody having access. And the same thing isn't always going to help to bridge the gap between things that have been unfairly withheld or are unavailable to folks. So that is what's bringing us now, as we see disparities being brought out more and more, and injustices that continue to occur, to this conversation about racial and social justice today. The reason I share this with you is because it's important to understand that we cannot talk about justice if we don't understand very succinctly and very intentionally, and aren't deliberate about making sure that we maintain the clarifications between these areas of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. And the reason I realign them to spell DIE is because the mindsets that we've had in the past must die in order for us to move forward and make the progress that is necessary. Many wonder why. Why do we need to still focus on this idea of race? Why can't we just talk about everyone and everything? Well, it's amazing, I tell you, when we think about this, because we recognize that the dimensions of diversity, thanks to Garden, Schwartz, and Rowe, indicate that there are a number of different attributes that we all have that fill this spectrum, if you will, of diversity. And yes, we're aware that there are issues around age. Yes, we're aware that there are issues around LGBTQ plus community, religion, ability, all of these other issues that we need to address. But because of our history with slavery and the fact that we are still dealing with the residual effect of that, folks, I submit to you that if we can figure this race thing out, then we will be far ahead of the game when it comes to being able to knock out everything else. As long as we can continue to function and folks can succeed by making sure that we have systems of injustice in place that continue to hold people back because of their race or ethnicity, we will continue to struggle with this issue of othering and never get to a place where we can truly fulfill the creed of this country. When we are sitting in a time in 2022 where it was just in March where the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was signed into law by President Biden, it just this year became illegal to lynch people in this country. An act that was passed with a vote of 422 to 3 in our House of Representatives, unanimously, thankfully, in the Senate. But we still had 3 dissenters in our House of Representatives. When we're sitting in a time where we've got House Bill 40 that is still sitting at the status of being introduced in our 117th Congress by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, a bill that establishes a commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans under the Act of the African Americans Act, when we're still waiting for that to make it to the floor, to be debated and ultimately passed, we still have an issue of race in this country. Slide, please. So what more can we do? What can we do to talk about this, to keep the conversation going and create opportunities for folks to weigh in and engage? Well, I submit to you, we need to talk about race. It's no longer just okay to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and hope that the race issue won't come up because it makes us uncomfortable. Hope that the race issue will go away and somehow correct itself. But we need to talk about it in the workplace. And here are a few things just I'll share with you that I think will be helpful in thinking about how to do that. It's important to avoid making assumptions. In other words, you're not going to change my mind as if that is the only goal in having this conversation, because what that does is it activates biases. It activates a resistance that will not help us to make headway with that. Instead, what I recommend is an approach that allows us to ask ourselves the question of what can I do to impact this for the better? The next item that I would recommend we avoid is taking a position of accusation and seeing any approach to discuss this as accusatory of you or your colleagues or anyone else. You know, often when I'm training and I'm conducting sessions, I make a point to acknowledge that white men, white women, white people are welcome into the space of having these conversations. It's not fair to assume that every person who is not a person of color or who is not a woman or who is not someone who is in the group that has traditionally and historically made certain that there were certain groups that were marginalized. It's not fair to assume that everyone is against folks. So it's important to understand that in the way that many of the groups who have been marginalized recognize that there is intersectionality that exists and there are differences of opinion and position and motivation and perspective and desire in those groups. It's also the same when we're talking about groups of white folks. The reality is that many of the gains that were made around civil rights and other movements have not just been made by the folks who were directly affected by that. Again, it was those who were willing to step outside of the norm and go against solidarity for things that were unfair and unjust, who were willing to also step up and stand with them. And we always need to make sure that the space is welcome for anyone that chooses to engage. Those who choose not will take the position, I didn't create this problem. It's not my issue. It's not for me to be here. And what I would submit is to see this instead instead of being an accusation, see it as an invitation to everyone to be able to recognize and acknowledge the fact that, hey, I might not relate. I might even have some questions around the legitimacy of this, but even though I might not relate, how can I make sure that I don't perpetuate this system, if you will, that continues to hurt and harm and relegate people to the lower rungs of society? The third thing that we want to avoid is division, approaching this from a place of division and making declarative statements that we're not all racist and you're not all victims. You know, often this isn't about figuring out whether a person is a racist or trying to point fingers and place blame. Again, this is about coming together and figuring out who are we going to be, how are we going to make this difference, and how are we going to own up to this hope it is that we often spread or consider ourselves standing for, and making sure that everyone benefits from it. Instead, we want to see the opportunity, if you will, to disrupt and ask ourselves the question, how can I be one to challenge the status quo, especially when the status quo is one that seems to continue to hurt and harm others? Slide, please. Those are the things that we can do as individuals. As we look at our organizations, as I come to a close, as we look at our organizations, the things that we can do with respect to leadership, the things that I recommend are paramount, is for leaders, especially those who are CEOs, those who are executive directors, those who are, if you will, leading the charge in these organizations. It's important to make sure that there's engagement. And with that engagement, that comes expectations that clarify for the folks who look to you for leadership, that the expectation is for them to engage fully and that there will be progress made. It will be monitored, it will be tracked, and it will be evaluated. because it's not enough to just make declarative statements. It's not enough to just have performative measures where we just do training and we have conversations and we don't look at how we can perform better as organizations and really actually move the needle, if not smash the record player when it comes to us continuing to engage in the same practices over and over again. We need to make sure that we're dedicating resources, if you will, to this work. We're dedicating resources, both human and financial. Human, making sure that we've got enough hands and hearts engaged in this work and that folks see themselves in it. They understand their roles and responsibilities, and those who are asked to lead it are respected as such and supported as such. And when it comes to financial, it will take money. And that is just the reality. There is no way to really make the headway that is necessary around improving a system of inequity and injustice without making sure that the proper measures are there to invest in not only a better system, but the people who have been harmed by the system. We know what your value is when we know where you put your money. It will take money. And last but not least, in thinking about goals, what we often take our clients through is a framework that is labeled RISK. It stands for making sure that your goals are relevant, they're intentional, they're sustainable, and they're based on knowledge. They're knowledge-based. So relevant goals, meaning you know who you are as an organization in your workplace. You know in the marketplace what it is that's needed with respect to what can be done to absolutely improve upon equity. Is it that we need to make sure that more business owners, people who are opening and owning businesses that are coming from traditionally marginalized, historically marginalized communities, do they have access to resources that will help them to be successful in that? Within the community, what more is needed? How can we show up as a corporate citizen and with a greater commitment to corporate social responsibility to make sure that we are making headway in this space? These are just a few of the things. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's certainly a great place to start when we think about what is it that we can do to help improve upon the condition of race. When we're talking about the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're taking into account the different experience that different races in and of themselves have. And while we're talking about this, I want to be very clear in pointing out something that I've noticed, and that is the use of the term BIPOC, which I'm not a big fan of, simply because BIPOC in and of itself seeks to lump together the experiences of people from different races and ethnicities and different experiences all into one category. And it's important to make sure that we give space and grace, if you will, to the reality of each of those individual experiences. And we call them out as they are, allowing them an opportunity to step into the spotlight and shine and receive the proper focus and recognition that is necessary to address the issues within those respective communities. So I encourage you to think about that the next time you're inclined to let that term roll off of your lips, because it's critical to understand that it's not always about your intentions, but ultimately the impact of your actions on those who are on the receiving end. Slide, please. What I've noticed in decades of doing this work is often there's a journey that we follow, a path that we kind of fall into. And typically when we get ready to do this, there's a level of courage that needs to be activated amongst leaders and all who are going to engage in doing work to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially if you're going to talk about the issue of race. And that courage is usually followed by a conviction. You've come to the conclusion that you must, you have to, and if you don't, who will? And we keep that going until we finally get to a place to where things start to simmer down and we get to a place of comfort. And I can say to you that those of us who are in the industry are concerned that this is where we're headed now that COVID restrictions have been lifted and people are returning back to normal or new normals or whatever it is that we're going to call it. We don't want the courage and the conviction that created a sense of urgency before to address these issues to dissipate into comfort and complacency. Because once that happens, we lose critical ground. And it's not until there's another challenge that comes up that people finally remember, oh yeah, I need to talk to you. I need to make sure that I'm engaging you. I'm including you in conversation and paying attention to what you say so that I'm clear about what's happening with you. I was asked once, what is the most important aspect, diversity, equity, or inclusion? What would you say? And inclusion is what I think is the most important, simply because it's through that practice of inclusion, of engaging one another, that we get an understanding of where we're falling short in diversity or even in equity. So I encourage you all to just be mindful of the journey. And I want you to always be asking yourself, where are you? Where are you? Are you getting to a place of comfort? And do you need to be revived, renewed, re-energized around this? And what will it take to make that happen? Because the reality is, folks, that we've got a lot of folks out here who may have had hope at one time, are still grappling to try to figure out how to find hope in this society that we live in. And they need help. We need, those of us who are in the industry and out speaking about this all the time, we need help because we can't do it alone. And when it comes to this country and who it is that we are and what it is that we stand for, and even your state in Iowa, as you think about how you adopt the ideas of these United States that you're a part of and bring forth the ideas, the promises that you make so that you can have integrity as a state, so that you can have integrity within your organizations, within your society. I just encourage you all to keep in mind that this issue is not going away. And I hope that you choose to continue to keep this at the forefront, that you choose to continue to invest time and effort in understanding what is happening across our racial barriers, and that you connect with communities, get clear about what it is that they need, and that you choose to make a difference. As I close, I will leave you with a quote by one of my favorite leaders, and that is the late Nelson Mandela. May your choices reflect your hopes, not your fears. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michele. And I'm going to ask one of the questions that was submitted quickly before we close here. But I wanted to ask, the comment that kind of preceded it is that DEI professionals are charged with moving the needle in their respective organizations, but many times they don't necessarily have the authority or the power to implement the initiatives without having to check with a supervisor, a manager, a VP, or a president before they proceed. If you had a few quick tips on getting DEI professionals autonomy and the power to implement change, where do you start?
Well, I'm asked this question quite a bit. And I would say that, first off, I think that's a conversation that starts before you accept the role. And that's a conversation where when you're sitting down and you're negotiating the terms of your employment, when you're having this discussion with the potential employer, you ask the question, what are your expectations of me coming into this role? You get clarity around that before you go in, because that will give you some insight into how the company and its leaders are looking at it. Also, as the DEI professional, I recommend that you go in and you understand, you embrace your power and what it is that you are capable of contributing to the organization. Don't see yourself as someone who's there waiting to be told what to do, but come in knowing what it is that you can contribute and own that space. That's on the part of the DEI professional, but it's not just a one-sided deal. The organization in and of itself has a responsibility to make sure that that DEI professional is properly positioned to have the level of authority and influence that is necessary for them to do whatever is expected. And that is one of the reasons why I often advocate for the chief diversity officer, or that role, to be positioned where it reports directly to the president and CEO or the executive director of the organization. Often those roles are put into HR, which creates a bit of a conflict, because if you're understanding what DE&I is, it's not just an HR issue. And that's another myth right there. The assumption that this is just a workforce thing, put the person in HR. It's an organizational development issue. So that means that HR ends up being one of those departments that must be audited by this person. And if I'm reporting to HR and, in my supervisory structure, that's going to be a problem. So we need to make sure that DEI professionals are properly positioned, that they also have the resources to be able to accomplish the goals and meet the expectations of the CEO. And again, that they are able to come in, and as they're ready to stand in their power to own that space, that they have the flexibility, the freedom, and the support to do so.
All right. Well, thank you, Michele, for a great start this morning. I've got a surprise for the conference attendees. We're fortunate to have 100 copies of Michele's co-authored book, You at Work. And the book explores the nuances of bringing our whole selves to work, challenges, and shedding the outdated notion of asking employees to check the humanity at the door. A lot of the themes that we've just been talking about this morning. We have the book registration link available in the chat, and the first 100 copies of the book, the first 100 to respond will be mailed the book courtesy of the Gazette. And on that note, it's now time at 10:10. We start our block of sessions for the morning, and we'll be back together at 12:20 for the closing keynotes with Dan Gable and Clarissa Chun. Enjoy the morning sessions. Thank you again, Michele, and thank you to all of our attendees on behalf of the team. Thanks.